what got me the promotion is not going to get me the next promotion, because at this level, I need to start behaving and thinking differently. They keep thinking about success being themselves and not the team. They have to shift the mentality. The team's success means my success as a leader. They realize they're not delegating nearly enough. We typically work on trying to create a point in their typical weekly schedules where they will stop doing the day-to-day business as usual madness and devote thinking time. They've been able to create a culture that can be replicated in the next generation, which is arguably the ultimate example of successful leadership. In my view, the only way it can be done really well is with leaders who put the company, the employees, and the clients ahead of themselves. And this is relatively unusual.
Hi everyone, my name is Varya and this is Shameless Careers, a podcast that helps high-achieving professionals redefine success on their own terms and build careers they truly love. As always, please do give a thumbs up to this episode. It really helps the podcast reach new people. In today's episode, we're talking about what really happens when you reach the top title on the corporate ladder. What mindset shifts are needed at that level? And what do people most commonly struggle with? To explore this, I'm joined by David Feld, an executive coach who works with senior leaders at international firms like JP Morgan, Ford, Schroders, Fidelity and BNY Mellon. Prior to this, David spent 3 decades in leadership roles within investment banking and asset management industries. So, David, thank you so much for being here with me today.
It's a great pleasure.
Let's start with this moment when people get promoted to, say, top title on the corporate ladder. A lot of people think that that's the moment when you feel like you have finally made it, you can be happy, you have achieved success that you've been long waiting for. Is this what actually is happening in practice?
I would say that the people that feel they've made it are those that haven't thought down the road, because oftentimes they've made this promotion. Let's say they're 40 years old. There's many years of work still to come, but they've been focused on that promotion. What does it bring? What responsibilities do they now have that they haven't really thought about? And oftentimes these promotions are to make people become leaders. Most of us don't think about what does it take to become a leader and to be an effective leader. Because to become promoted most of the time, particularly in financial services, it's about doing. It's about getting the client, earning so much money for the company. And that's usually an individual effort of some sort. Now they're promoted to leadership. They need to achieve through others, through the people they're leading. That's a very different situation. And many times the people I've seen that have had the greatest trouble achieving as much as they're capable of is when they keep thinking about success being themselves and not the team. They have to shift the mentality. The team's success means my success as a leader. That's a big mind shift change for many people.
Yeah.
So it's really a question of, let's say for someone who makes managing director of one of the great international companies, that's a big achievement. What do they really seek next? And most people don't think about that. They just think about that achievement. So once they have it, then the question is, what do I wish to achieve now?
And how do people think about it based on your practice? What do they typically want to achieve next? Or what should they want to achieve next?
Well, I would argue that they should start to think about what has given them the most satisfaction in their careers. And what clues does that give as to how they seek to continue to improve, to learn, etc. And for many people, if it's landing the deal, they love hunting and getting the prey. For those people, shifting that towards being the, how do I express this, the armorer that provides the ammunition to the team to go out and get the prey, that's a big shift. And so if they've had satisfaction with any sort of people development along the way in their careers, they can build on that to really become an ever more effective leader. If they haven't had it up to now, that's when the coaching often comes in to help them think differently about what gives me sense of purpose. It's a question many people don't ask themselves. I was fairly poor at doing it myself in my decades as a banker. I really liked what I did, but I wasn't paying enough attention to down the road. Most people don't, particularly in investment banking, right? There's the next deal, and the next deal. It's a relentless pace. And most people don't allow themselves to slow down for a minute and think, how could I work differently rather than work harder? Oftentimes, it's realizing that they have put so much into their jobs that it's caused a lack of balance in their lives, with their families in particular. And I speak as one who messed it up pretty badly when I was a banker. Getting the balance between achieving professional success and paying proper attention to one's family and giving credence to one's partner and one's children. That's probably the biggest imbalance I observe in most people.
And can you tell me more about this disbalance? What does this imbalance in personal life look like, and what are the consequences of this imbalance?
It generally looks like never switching off. Never switching off evenings, weekends, what have you. So that means if there's a sports day to go to, even if the business person goes to the sports day, they're on their phone. It's become particularly bad in the last 20 years. I mean, when I was a young business guy, at least we didn't have the mobile phones. But since then, there's no escape. So therefore, for people to really achieve some balance in their lives, they need to proactively turn off the phone and figure out, and not just sporadically, but can we figure out a consistent way of turning off the phone that doesn't harm the business, but it enables family to come into the picture. And that's really tough. It's really tough because, and I'm speaking from way too much experience in my own life about the lure of doing the business.
So what do people usually regret when they don't switch off their phone?
They regret that they're accused of not caring about their family.
Do they feel like they have prioritized the wrong things?
They generalize and try and justify, and I'm speaking for myself as much as my clients, that there was no other way to do it. The business had to be done. I had to be there for the CEO, had to be there for my client. And so, and this is a fact of human nature. People can justify almost anything. I really believe that the balance can be achieved. The way people achieve it is if they decide they wish to do it. Because if they don't wish to do it, it doesn't matter what sort of protocols I can offer them that I've observed with other clients, it won't happen.
And so if someone does feel like they're out of balance, how do you coach them to overcome this and to bring more balance in their lives? For example, when it comes to work versus family life.
Well, I first ask, what would good look like? What would balance look like? And they start to kind of dream about it a bit. It's really interesting. And so through a series of questions, we can often define a reasonable balance that's dramatically different from the way they're conducting their lives right now. So with that definition and a sense that they're really motivated to try and do it, then we start to try and build protocols. So for example, when have you achieved balance before? What was an event where you didn't take the phone to the football match? Or where you actually switched off for the weekend? You found a babysitter and for your children, you took your wife away. You took your husband away. Most people have had moments of balance, even the most crazed workaholics. And then we build on that. What caused that balance? How were you able to shift your mindset? And when you start to look at the incidents in people's lives, it can really give them a foundation upon which to build a different way to go about it, so they replicate that more often. So it was a step-by-step, like most things in life. We very rarely have conversions that take us from black to white or white to black.
And how about the practicalities of it? Obviously, a lot of these people, you have mentioned it earlier yourself, are on the hook for urgent deliverables, and the company doesn't wait, right? If we're working in an environment of high pace, in a high pace environment of quick results, So what practically can these people change to introduce this time in their lives that they can spend on a dinner with their wife or like their family time, for example?
Well, as an example, let's say they're used to responding almost immediately to something from the CEO. So I'd ask the question, have you ever asked the CEO if you could have a few extra days to deal with it? Because the CEO would typically not give a deadline, just say, I'd love you to do this. Oh, I've never done that. So then the next question would be, what's the downside to asking? There probably isn't, David. I'll do that. So they ask.
Actually, there may be more like space and more time to accomplish something than you think. But what about, of course, another like counter argument is, okay, if there is a lot of work and a lot of pressure, a lot of firefighting to be done, what if there is no room for delay? How should this person find this balance? What are other tips that can help them?
Well, there's a technique we use called 80-20. So I sit down with clients and we look at 3 categories: direct reports, stakeholders, and tasks. And we look at them quite deeply. And then we try and define what are the 20 or 30% of each of those categories that generate typically, believe it or not, 80% of the outcomes from that category. It's amazing how accurate that usually is. And people are like, I'm devoting way too much time over there. Way too much time. Because it's not generating very much for me. So what happens when they start to apply this is that, one, they're spending more time on the stuff that really generates results. 2, they realize they're not delegating nearly enough. Because, again, we're talking about people now that are managing director. But part of the problem is they've gotten to where they are, per my earlier point, because they were doers. They're still doing too much. They're spending time on stuff they shouldn't be doing. So when we analyze the daily activity of a client, it often helps them realize that there are a number of things they don't need to be doing. They could delegate them, or they could not do them at all because they're not really giving any value. It forces them to think, am I not delegating because I love doing too much? Or am I not delegating because I don't think my team is up to it? Then that leads to a whole other conversation about what are the qualities of your direct reports? Are there some tough decisions you need to be making now about some of those people? But the ultimate win is when the managing director starts to delegate some of their 20% to their 20% direct reports. Can you imagine? It's amazing. And the more they do that, the more they start to free up time for what they really should be doing as a managing director, which is thinking 2 or 3 years down the road. What are the big elements we need to think about? And what are the changes in structure and team and even product development that are required for us to get 2 to 3 years down the road? They don't have time to do that when they're doing the day-to-day madness. So much of this is about changing what they're working on.
And what are the biggest challenges people face with this 80-20 principle?
Sticking with it, of course.
But what are the criteria for this 20% then?
We find things that generate 80% of the category. So let's say it's stakeholders. In that case, we'll say, okay, what are you trying to achieve with those stakeholders? What do they need to deliver for you? And it becomes apparent pretty quickly that this person, wow, they deliver a lot. And that person, actually, I'm not getting much from them. And you suddenly realize, I'm really misallocating time here. You don't have to be brutal about it with the person that's not bringing you much value, but you automatically, generally, start to reallocate. So it's not hard to. None of this stuff is hard to do. It's just getting people to do it. And once they're latched onto it, then it happens. But getting out of habits is hard.
I guess one question that I have is that, how do you define what a good outcome is? Because there are a lot of objectives that you are trying to optimize for in a corporate career. It can be, some of them can be very measurable. I guess that makes the answer easier as to how you do define this 20% of the most impactful stuff. But there are a lot of other considerations. For example, I don't know, perception of stakeholders, some more objectives that you can't put a number against. So what's a good way to identify what is it that a good outcome looks like, this 20%?
Now, there are times when you can measure it. So if someone is leading a team of a revenue team doing X, and their results consistently increase and increase and increase, that's almost by definition a measurable quantity. But oftentimes for people, particularly those that have really big leadership jobs, it's as much, are they bringing along their people ever more productively? And there's various ways to measure that, of course. Oftentimes it is the bottom line, but it's not everything. Because one of the big techniques in coaching is, how can a person be more effective in influencing their colleagues? So not necessarily their direct reports, although we want them to influence those as well, but their peers, their board members, their clients. And so, for example, in one case, one of the major clients of this particular company and the person working for it that I was coaching, huge increase in activity between my client company and the company they were doing business with. And it was all because the client started to realize how they were coming across to their client and shifting how they delivered their messages. Not the content so much, but how it was delivered.
Interesting. So when we speak basically about 80-20, this 20 can be a whole host of things. It can be something like perception. It can be something like an actual bottom line of your team's motivation and or delivery of the message as opposed to content. So basically, to come back to the question earlier, to understand what this 20% is, you need to understand, like, in your particular circumstance, what's moving the dial most.
That's exactly right.
And is there a question that a person can ask themselves to understand what this 20% is for their job that could open up their minds about it?
Well, to view what has been your activity for the past week. What has really paid off? People they're also busy to try and accomplish this for next week. They rarely look back to think, what did I actually accomplish? And what were the factors behind that accomplishment? So when they start to ask themselves that, then stuff starts to shift to a certain degree. But think about it. How often do we do that? I never did it. As a coach, I do it a fair bit now, but I was an emerging markets investor. Actually, I did look at it to a certain degree, because one of the keys about, I think, any business job is, where did I go wrong? And what can I learn from that? And arguably, the really effective business people are somewhat consistent in asking that. But they're usually asking it about business decisions they made more than people decisions they made. That's one of the big changes. I mean, that's why I'm so often, particularly for the MDs, trying to get them to think more deeply about, if you made this people decision versus that people decision, what would the return on the decision be? As opposed to, we just got to land that client.
Can you tell me more about that? So are you saying that as a leader, you oftentimes over-index on the business decisions, because that's obviously what you're trying to improve and progress, but actually you can sometimes forget that people's decision may be even more consequential for your business? And so would you say that that's true, that people's stuff can sometimes be deprioritized? And here, what's the biggest tip that you would give to team leaders in this environment?
It's certainly, there's an imbalance there between business decisions and people decisions. And the biggest tip is really, if you look forward 2 years and you have a dream, you the business leader, about what your business could look like, what does that imply for the people you need to do that, to achieve it? Who are they and what are their qualities? And once that thought process is gone through, then we can compare the coach and the client to, what does today look like with that team? And then gaps are pretty obvious. And this leads to probably one of the biggest changes for people that have been made managing director, which is making tough people decisions. Because one of the interesting things in business life is leaders tend to spend more time on the people that are not doing well And that's a natural thing. But think about it. Would it be more productive for that goal 2 years out to spend more time on the person in your team that's really good? What could we do with them so they'd be spectacular? But actually a lot of the time is spent on the person who's not so good. So a lot of the conversations I have with people around, let's identify the person that's not doing so well. What are the factors behind that? Is it that their capability is not up to the quality you need? Or are they in the wrong seat? There's this phrase, we talked about good to great, right? Are they in the wrong seat on the bus? That's one of the coolest things when we work out that the person could really be great, but they're just in the wrong seat. So we have to figure out, is the person in the wrong seat? Or is the person, should they not be on the bus?
So we have spoken about bringing more balance in someone's life, right? We are speaking now about how someone should slow down and think about more strategic things as opposed to like daily firefighting. But probably the biggest challenge to all of that is that usually these people are in an environment of a lot of pressure. So what tips would you give on the stress management front in this environment?
We typically work on trying to create a point in their typical weekly schedules where they will stop doing the day-to-day business as usual madness and devote thinking time. Let's find, what is a day in your schedule where you typically realize that there's somewhat less pressure? There generally is for most people, even in the most crazed jobs, a particular day of the week or time of the day where it's somewhat less crazy. Let's identify that first, and we'll do it through a series of questions and answers. And then let's carve out a period of time. And typically at first, it's only going to be an hour. But even getting the hour is a big deal for people. And then what can you do in that hour from a thinking point of view that could start to give balance in various ways, whether family versus work or business decisions versus people decisions, etc. And it's sort of like the story I told a minute ago about the woman who wanted to have dinner with her family every now and then. Start with a small step, but embed it and then build on it. And generally, eventually, for most people, they'll come up with, let's say, somewhere between 10 to 20% of their working week is devoted to non-business as usual thinking time, dreaming time even, cogitating. And they're so unused to it at first. That's why you have to start small with just an hour. But eventually, it becomes a really treasured moment in their week where they can think down the road. I can't stress this enough, Vadia, thinking down the road.
And we have touched upon a number of qualities that a senior leader at this level is expected to demonstrate. The 80-20 principle, focus on people and making sure that you spend time on your team and understanding where the people, on which seat on the bus they should be. Introducing more balance and strategic thinking in their lives. Is there anything else that's an absolute prerequisite for this next level that people should be aware of?
Yes. Really understanding where they believe their own bullshit and stopping that.
Tell me more about that.
Well, it's an interesting factor because people that are confident, the ideal combination is someone who's confident, who does not believe their own bullshit. So confident means they believe they have the qualities necessary to do whatever the responsibilities are, but they don't believe that they are the one. And so I think I mentioned to you earlier, I use a personality assessment tool called Hogan. Hogan is one of the great assessment tools in the world. I would argue it's one of the top 3. And one of its qualities that it measures is called bold. And it defines bold as an overestimation of one's capabilities. There are a lot of people like this in investment banking. And it's a strength most of the time. They really believe in themselves. But as they rise up the ranks of their companies and their guard is down because of either being under tremendous stress, like the global financial crisis in 2008, or when they're totally relaxed, because they believe their own bullshit, they can make dreadful decisions. And there's no question that people, even if they don't have this quality, we can all do with, in effect, two heads being better than one all the time. And therefore, share one's thoughts with other people. Don't be afraid to say, this is what I'm considering. What are your thoughts on it? Because when you do that together, there'll be a synthesis of the two ideas, and it'll be stronger. And so that's one of the biggest things that I would advise people to do, is to really be careful about, in effect, intuitively making decisions too quickly because they think they have most of the answers.
And that probably requires building a certain non-hierarchical culture. Maybe could you tell me more about that? What are the effective cultures that you've seen effective leaders build? What does this culture look like?
It looks like where no one person feels they have the answer. So let's say we're at the executive committee level, for argument's sake. Now, each of those people will have a huge responsibility for a certain area of a company. But the great companies are not operating in silos, because there are a lot of companies that are heavily siloed. Investment banks are classic for this in many respects. They're somewhat better than they used to be. But if the people at the top are consistently talking to one another to do exactly what I said a few minutes ago, it will also often cause it'll help define a direction of travel for the entire company. But secondly, it'll enable course corrections to occur much more consistently and often, because the people that are driving the business in each of those divisions are talking to each other. And this is more unusual than you would think. And so one of the mantras that I've always thought of in coaching is one human being plus one human being worth more than two. And that can only occur if people are complementing each other. And that can only occur if they're talking to each other consistently and open-heartedly. And that's not necessarily the normal default setting for people.
Yeah, but there's also politics, I guess, right? That prevents people from being as authentic as we're talking about now. So how do we deal with that then?
Well, much of it will... great companies are a combination of a leadership at the top that is setting the culture that can permeate down, but also a culture that things can permeate up from the bottom and meet somewhere in the middle. And so, in my view, the only way it can be done really well is with leaders who put the company, the employees, and the clients ahead of themselves. And this is relatively unusual. Think of all the CEOs. You can read about a CEO failure every week in the FT, if not every day. It's astounding how often CEOs are shot. Why are they shot? Because they've not been effective at marshaling the resources of the company, because they put too much of it as I'm the man. And it's typically a man. I'm the man. Think about it. It's really terrible. So the great companies, again, going back to good to great on some of those, they not only have a leadership which engenders this culture throughout the company that I mentioned, but they've been able to create a culture that can be replicated in the next generation, which is arguably the ultimate example of successful leadership. If the culture can carry on, even though the senior people leave, like let's say they retire, I mean, how powerful is that?
I guess it's also more difficult. It depends on how the business is doing. If it is doing very well, I think it's an environment where it's easier to build an open culture, versus if there is more pressure and the business is not doing great, I guess that introduces.
Oh, no, I would argue the opposite.
Really?
When the company's doing really poorly, that means that change can be engendered typically by new people. But you think about it. We could go through so many examples in history of either political change or company change where, because things were so bad, changes were promulgated that were unthought of or unheard of previously. So to get the change, arguably, when a company's in really bad shape, I think it's easier to bring in people at that stage. But to keep the successful culture going, that is altogether more difficult in many respects. There are not many companies that can do it.
How come?
Human nature. People get, we're successful. Let's just keep doing what we were doing. Most companies, when they have a successful product, will run it until the very end. They don't want to cannibalize the success of that product. So one of the great cannibalizations of all time was the iPod. So this was the very first digital portable music thing after the Walkman. And Steve Jobs said, we're going to kill it. You could still buy it, but he said, I'm going to incorporate that in the iPhone. That was a very unusual decision. Very unusual. And there are lots of examples of companies where they died because they couldn't make the shift. So Kodak, have you ever heard of Kodak? The greatest film company in the world for decades. And it went bankrupt because it couldn't believe that it had to shift into digital. I could tell you, growing up in America, Kodak just kicked ass. It went bankrupt.
Yeah.
Because it said, well, we got to keep going with what we do best.
If you had to give one piece of advice to someone who is aspiring to be promoted to a leadership position, what would it be?
Put yourself in the shoes of the people that are considering you. We rarely do that. So there will be several stakeholders that will be considering that person for promotion. Think about what drives them as human beings. What are their values? What have you observed that's really important for them? Ask people that work for them. Observe them yourselves. Take your time doing it. And then, with that information, think about how you're coming across to those people now. Do you shift how you present to them? Do you speak in a somewhat different use of a vocabulary? You don't shift your personality, but can you shift the way you deliver? Consider the audience.
And once you got the promotion, what's the biggest piece of advice for someone to operate at a senior level?
Observe those that are at your level as to what they're doing and what successes and or failures they've had, so you can incorporate the changes that you need to make. How much this evolution from doing to enabling. There'll be people that have made the evolution really well. Observe them. And then look at the ones that are arguably not doing so well. Are those doers that have never made the shift? There will be in most companies, and these investment banking companies, there'll be dozens of people like this. There's all sorts of information for you there. Observe it.
And the final question on identity. What recommendation in relation to identity would you give to someone who is about to has become more senior?
Well, it comes back to looking down the road. What does good look like 10 years out? Are you comfortable that you will be really fulfilled, a sense of purpose from the road you're on now? If not, let's talk.
David, thank you so much for a really insightful conversation. Really appreciate you being here with me today.
Oh, I really enjoyed it, Vadia. Thank you for asking me.